we're assuming cloud native technology, not using VMware with Zerto. A few terms that I'm not making any assumption about what you do or don't know about cloud technologies, but I wanted a few terms, at least so you can reference it back. I'll cover them. Region is just a physical area, you know, like Ashburn, Chicago, Phoenix. So it's physical location. And most of the clouds are all over the world. An availability domain is an area that is in the same data center. Excuse me, or it's within the same region, but it might be a secondary data center. In some cases, the availability domain actually will be in the same physical building, but usually it's in the same region, connected by high speed, low latency type of networks. The general idea is you're in a different building. If one burns down, you're going to continue to move on. A fault domain is a group of hardware that would be in the same building, but it might be physically separate architecture. And honestly, with the JD Edwards application, it's kind of a key design consideration. And we'll talk about why availability domains can be a problem if you're thinking some traditional architectures. The other thing is in cloud technologies, network security groups, there's defaults set up for you. It's like a virtual firewall. I like to think of it as working best as like a set of whitelists, but it's more than just that. It's more powerful than a whitelist, but oftentimes that's what you do. You set ingress and egress type rules. So that's important for today's session. So a couple of key topics is you have to think about when you're doing the DR design is, what are your recovery objectives, RTO, RPO. Zero RTO is feasible. And I think everybody on the call should understand that it's feasible, but it might not be feasible if you consider cost because it's expensive. If you can take a short outage, and a lot of manufacturing firms can. Sorry, I've got a lot of bouncing. My apologies. If you can take a 1 hour outage, effectively you can take a reboot time of your entire system, much more affordable option. And even if you go to like a 4-hour RTO recovery time, it does further reduced your cost. Our recovery point has not been as big of an issue as RTO because of the modern database tools. Oracle Enterprise and even SQL Server. You'll probably lose all of your in-process transactions. So if you have 50 people keying things in, if they were in the middle of some data entry, they'll lose that, but that is it. And it's really, really expensive for people to retain in-process transactions. I have actually never been asked to architect a solution like that. Everybody that I've talked to said, yeah, okay, they lose where they were midstream, but that's not as bad as losing everything they've done for like the last hour. So RPO is generally not as critical as RTO in cloud designs, just due to the nature of the database tools. So we're going to talk about 4 different areas related to the solution. We'll talk about the network layer, host layer, the JDE layer, and the database layer. So there's multiple avenues we need to talk about. High level, there are limitations to JDE. It is not the best solution for a highly available cloud solution because of how it's designed. You also need to be on some of the later tools releases in order to take advantage of some of the more recent capabilities like the virtual batch queues, which effectively allows active-active clustering if set up properly. We've been waiting for that feature from Oracle for a long time. I know several of our employees have been discussing with Oracle development for a very long time about, can you get that going so that we can do true active clustering instead of using, content switches and database triggers. The latest release that comes with release 22 of JD Edwards is the 926 tools. And this tools release will make it much easier to implement what's known as the blue-green technology. And I have a slide I'll show a little bit later about what blue-green means, but there is an Oracle white paper on it. But as it is, you really can't use the blue-green architecture for anything but operating system related patches and possibly some middleware patches, but you certainly don't want to use it for JD Edwards. And when we get to the drawing, I'll explain why. Also, if you've seen some HA designs, oh, I forgot to mention, workflow and scheduler still not set up to work in a true HA environment. Oracle's working on it, but they wanted to take care of package builds and zero downtime package deployment and the virtual batch queues. They can only do so much at once. It's on their roadmap, but if you are heavy into workflow and using a scheduler, you got some thinking to do in planning in your architecture, and it may not be that big of a deal for you. If you did get a design from 2 years ago from Oracle, throw them out. They really aren't good enough. There's inaccuracy. A lot of them assume, doing high availability costs, an availability domain. And unfortunately, the tests have shown that putting JD Edwards in an HA scenario in multiple availability domains does not perform well. So you would be wise not to design that solution because you'd be unhappy. Oracle will now tell you that. That doesn't matter if you're using OCI, Azure, AWS, it doesn't matter which tool you're using. JD Edwards is a chatty application, and trying to do HA across a region or a high availability domain is just impossible. DR across an HA or an availability domain or a region is an acceptable design. Okay, so let's talk about the network layer. Sorry about that. This design right here is just talking about a single region, single fault zone. So just think of it as you've got a production system and nothing else at this point in time. So what you're doing here is, and this is a traditional drawing from that Oracle has, and we've modified it a little bit, but basically you put different components in different layers inside of your cloud in order to isolate and protect traffic. You notice up at the top here, we have the internet, we have gateways to get in and out of your system, like the NAT gateway is for inbound, the internet gateway is for outbound, and this is kind of an interesting setup in and of itself in most clouds. Some people think, oh, I should only have one device, but they work together. The support server could be a bastion server, it could be a jump station, it could be, in GSI's case, we've been known to use Enable or Kaseya to be sitting in a public subnet, and the only traffic that can get from the public subnet to the private subnet is through this server right here, and the network security groups in between each layer, making sure that that is the only traffic that can bounce back and forth. Now, there's a couple things you got to make sure you don't do. You notice we have a single fault domain right here, and we have a load balancing tier. This is still all the same subnet, but we're putting in, different tiers, and down here in the middle tier, we actually have a different subnet, but it is still a private subnet. And you do need to be careful if you put your database server in a different subnet than the rest of the network. And this is down here, I've got the database tier, but you need to make sure that stays on the same subnet as the enterprise server. If you don't do that, performance will suffer. We've found that even 1 or 2 milliseconds, just subnetting it on in the same area ends up causing problems. So I've got a big drawing, a big design, and spreads two slides. Now this drawing right here goes more towards a fault domain where you have a primary production, and then you have a secondary for DR purposes. And you can also use it for high availability depending upon what your business needs are and what your design. But this is a traditional high availability design with production on one side, the primary region, and I did OCI in this particular case, but it doesn't matter. The design would be just the same if you were sitting in Azure, and the secondary design. And you basically what you're doing is you're mimicking much of the architecture. You have web servers on the primary site. You have web servers on the secondary site. Now, one thing you don't want to do, you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, these are two regions. Let's say your primary region here is Virginia and your secondary region is Phoenix. You're thinking, well, we can just do high availability between these regions. And you would look at this design and come to that conclusion, but you'd be highly mistaken. The problem is in the design of the JD Edwards database. Even if you used advanced Golden Gate meshing, you still have issues with records going to the database. For those of you that understand JD Edwards, let's just use next numbers as an example. Let's say this is set up as an HA and you get routed into based on where you're located. Somebody in the sitting in Virginia would get routed automatically to this primary region, but somebody sitting in California might get routed to the secondary region. So let's say that happened. Both of these people are taking customer orders. So the person in Virginia goes to create a new order, gets a new number. The person sitting in California at the very same time goes to get a next number. They look to their respective tiers to the database to get a next number. They both get assigned the same next number because the sync between the database is not perfect. You can't, the mesh net database just will not work with JD Edwards. It is not yet to that level. So when you use this multiple region network, only one side or the other can be active. So this is an active passive scenario where only one side of the house can be active. However, let's assume that there's a truck crashes into the data center in Virginia and network connectivity is cut off here. And it looks like it's going to be quite some time. Well, you can either manually or set it up to automatically fail over to the system sitting in Phoenix. Now, this becomes your primary now. And Ashburn is an offline, and all of your transactions start get written to in the new area. So hopefully that's not too confusing to you. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to talk about it with you. This is just the second half of the drawing showing the database tier and a key to show you which machines are. So when you get the presentation, you can look it over. So just a few notes for performance issues around JDE. High availability is not feasible across regions or even availability domains. Oracle has done the testing. 2 years ago, the designs were saying you could do it across availability domains. It doesn't perform good enough. You will hate it. High availability can be achieved within fault domains. So that's our primary goal in talking to people. It's like, okay, at least within the same building, you have different hardware. And you know, you're making some assumptions, taking a slight risk, but you could achieve high availability within a fault domain. to save cost, if you can tolerate a 1-hour RTO, then DR is going to be very, very affordable, and it can be on standby. A 15-minute RTO is available if your DR remains hot. So a lot of people will try to save cost. The design I just showed you had 2 servers sitting in 2 regions. Many places will shut down the servers and the backup for cost savings. The cost in the cloud is going to be primarily for compute time and memory time. Disk time is rather affordable. So what you do is you shut the machines off, takes up disk space, but since you're not consuming compute and memory, your costs are dramatically reduced. However, if you've got a 15-minute RTO, there's no way you can spin up an entire JD Edwards system in 15 minutes. Well, it might, if you had just a few servers, maybe you could, but that's a very short time. 1 hour to 1.5 hours is more realistic if you shut down those servers and have to bring them live. You will need a load balancer in between the domains, which also means you have DNS issues you have to think about. So keep your DNS considerations, your user accounts. You probably, if you're using Microsoft Active Directory, you're probably going to need an Active Directory server in both domains. So plan that, take that into consideration as well. Because if your primary is down, you're still going to need name services. So your DR site's going to need it. The solution is a fantastic way to just take OS patches. We had one client that said that their operating system patches take 4 hours. That means when they bring JDE down to apply OS patches alone, they're down for 4 hours. If you used a blue-green technology, you could take those OS patches in the down system, and then when you fail over to the other one, those patches are already in place, and it is a workable solution, and you can save several hours of outage. You will need some scripting. You can count on having to write some scripts to make some changes to configurations. And you probably will need virtual IPs in order to take advantage of the JD Edwards, the fact that much of what goes into JD Edwards does embed machine names in it. Like when you submit a batch job, the underlying batch job, even if you submit it to a virtual queue, does a get host by name lookup and ignores the virtual machine name and embeds the server name in. Now, if you're using virtual queues, you've overcome that issue, but not everybody has implemented that. So the solution can be modified for just a DR only with the production remaining on premise. So basically, if you just wanted to keep your on-premise solution, but need to build out a DR solution and don't really want to buy the equipment, this is also a great solution for testing the cloud, if you will, but also using the cloud for your DR purposes. Okay, just some high level things. Do not segment the database. And I've mentioned it, it's a performance issue. We have people you can call that that tried this and rolled back. It is painful, and I would, a lot of people are saying, well, I'd like to keep my database separate so that if somebody hacks into my enterprise servers, at least my database isn't touched. Yeah, and that's a really good security best practice. It is, however, not a performance practice that is feasible. It's a risk that you have to absorb. Again, we're recommending that the web servers, the enterprise servers, and the database server reside on the same segment. The deployment server, if you want your package build performance to be any good, you really ought to keep it on the same segment as well. You can move it to a separate subnet, but then be prepared for slowness. If you can tolerate longer build times, it might be all right. When I did a lab install for release 22 in our lab, we had the database or deployment server on a separate segment from the others, And it took about 4 days to do code current ESUs that should have been done in about maybe 10 to 12 hours. So it does really drag things down. I've experienced it myself. And the package build was an exorbitant amount of time as well, somewhere around 24 hours, where it should have finished in eight hours. Now, integration servers, like if you have an AIS server that is more of a batch update type of situation, you can put that on a different subnet. Many people put that on the public subnet, where you have your Bastion server or remote support server. It is one place you could put it. You could put it inside the network with natting if you want, but many people that we're talking to are putting their AIS integration servers into a public subnet, so it's exposed to the outside world, but that's it. And you use the network NSGs to separate the traffic, and you filter it so that the traffic can only flow from machine to machine. Client workstation, same advice as the deployment server. We have one client that insisted on putting them in a separate subnet from the database and enterprise servers, and they suffered a little bit, check in, check outs. If they had to do package builds, usually only a couple of objects, not horrible. So, I mean, if you had to choose, put the deployment server with those other servers, client workstations, maybe you could live without it. It's one of those things I think you just need to be flexible and be prepared to move servers around. If you want perfect segmentation and perfect network design, performance may suffer. Maybe set it up that way and see if you can live with it. And if you can't, be prepared to move it. And my guess is you will move it. So I mentioned the blue-green technology before, and that I had a drawing. This comes right out of Oracle's a blue-green white paper from Oracle. There's a couple of problems with this design. So in looking at it, just think of one side or the other of the blue-green as being active and the other being passive on standby, but equal to, so blue and green are identical environments. You notice this database sitting in the middle, common database. The idea here, and if you were to read the Oracle blue-green technology for JD Edwards, they say it can be used for tools releases and operating systems. The problem with tools releases is this common database. So if you apply a bunch of ESUs to one environment or the other, if you're below tools release 9.2.6, which has the 0 deployment, you can't even do it, because if you apply the ESUs in one environment, you're effectively applying them in the other because of the common database. A lot of people are saying, well, even with the 9.2.6 that has the multiple serialized objects, and you basically, drain stop people over to the new to the new code, you still have things that are user-defined objects. I'm sorry, that was the word I was trying to come up with. You still have UDOs that you're applying that are stored in the database that aren't necessarily considered code that would get deployed through a build. So you need to be very careful with blue-green technology if you're planning to have one live, flip the switch, make the other, and reduce patches. But it does work great for operating system. So a couple of things to think about if you haven't gone to the cloud yet, on-prem to cloud. Couple options available to you. Most people go with IPsec. IPsec has been hacked, just so you're aware, but it's really difficult to hack if you've got 248-bit whatever the word is, encryption all set up. But MPLS is more like a dedicated connection, but do give yourself some time if you're going to go with MPLS. IPsec, you can usually get set up in a few hours. You're up and running. You're going over the public internet. It's pretty secure, and performance for a lot of our clients has been acceptable with that type of connectivity, especially if you're located close to the data center. So if your business is located in Chicago, let's say, and you've got your cloud providers in Chicago, IPsec's probably going to be acceptable performance to you if you can live with the security considerations. Again, MPLS takes a little bit of time. For best security, you want to lock down all public access, and again, use those network security groups to prevent cross-server penetration. It's inherent in the design. You almost have to go out of your way to remove it. So my advice is to leave the network security groups in place where it makes sense, like at the public access level, at the private access level. You definitely want to leave that in place. Whether or not you want to put your database and your workstations in a different subnet, it's up to you. I'd advise against it in most cases with JD Edwards. Okay. In talking about our design, again, JD Edwards, the web enterprise and Active Directory servers you want to put in both regions or availability domains. The deployment server may be considered a DR server. And it is a topic you need to talk to with your entire IT team. If you've stored all objects in the database, meaning your media objects, your print queue objects, and your deployment server objects are now up there, your deployment server probably doesn't need to be considered DR, and you would only leave it set up in one region. In the future, the deployment server will go away. Oracle's been saying they're going to make it go away for 10 years, but I think they're eventually going to get to it probably in the next 5 years. So the secondary site contains a replicated instance of the production platform. And there's multiple ways to build the secondary site. There are tools like Rackware that will copy from one site to another. If you're using Azure, there's Azure Site Recovery, really cool tool to just take site A and move it to site B. The other, I'd say Azure has a leg up on the other platforms when it comes to site recovery and building up new sites. They are really awesome. Oracle doesn't have a tool, but they do. There is a third-party tool called Rackware, which allows you to do it. And Rackware will work with any environment. That's particularly useful if you have a workload that's running an older version of an operating system where you can't stand up a new server. So let's say you've got a server with Windows 2008 and you can't get a copy of it, or a very old version of Linux, but you have to have the server in both locations. You can't build the server from scratch and copy all the data over because you can't get the OS. You could use Rackware to bring that workload over. It's a really cool tool for that. Rackware also is a sync tool. So let's say you have your media objects stored on a file system and not up on the database. If you're working in a DR situation or a replica or any two sites, you have to be able to get the file-based objects replicated. We've used a tool called RoboCopy successfully. Places didn't want to pay for any services. Some people use SAN replication to get file-based objects over there. That's a great solution. I know on-premise solutions use Zerto. Zerto doesn't work too well unless you've got VMware. But you just gotta keep in mind that if not everything is in the database, you do have flat files and file system objects to copy over. So in dealing with backups, lots to consider. Remember, JDE is metadata driven. Consider, if you haven't, make consideration of moving all file-based objects to the database. GSI had a client that was hit with a very extreme ransomware attack. They got all their backups destroyed, but they didn't get their database. They got their database backups, but they didn't get the database. They had to take the database offline and physically delete the files. They did not do that, but they did purge all of the backups. Since we had the database, we were able to rebuild their entire system from the database because it's metadata driven. In production, multiple web servers, you got enterprise servers, and you need Active Directory servers. The secondary site, you might want to do server level backups. You might want to do VMs by doing backing up your you can do image backups of your VMs. Just kind of think of like do some golden image thinking. And I haven't talked too much about immutable backups, but it's something that everybody ought to think about. With an immutable backup, it can't be destroyed. Think of it as a worm drive. Write once, read many. It wouldn't hurt to have a couple of those laying around. Some things to think about in JD Edwards. If you're not doing the immutable data backups, I think you should think about doing that. Web and JDE server access is restricted to a secondary site, and you're going to have to. I don't remember what I put that in there for. Sorry about that, guys. I had that for a reason. I just can't remember. The load balancer will require configuration. You have to remember we don't recommend HA across regions, so the load balancer will have to look to one region or another. If all of these websites, I'm assuming in much of our design that site A can see site B, however you design it. Therefore, you have to worry about duplicate names. So, you might have server JDE ENT, but you can't have JDE ENT sitting in your secondary location. You have to put like a DR on the end of it. But that's okay, because you can resolve that via host tables. So the secondary server would have an entry in it that says JDE ENT actually points to the IP address of JDE ENT DR. So you could just kind of fake it out. The host entry is basically going to point the enterprise server back to itself. That's the whole concept there. Integrations are a real killer in a design like this. Outside integrations that may point to servers, you may have some DNS changes to make. And Bill, I've only left you 10 minutes, but I'd like you to speak about the database layer. Welcome to the webcast, and talk about the things that you would need to think of in the cloud related to that. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill Rem to speak. Bill, I'll switch the slides when you need to.
Okay, great. Yep, I'm Bill Rem. I'm the head of the database managed services here, and we'll talk about some HADR. So here is a kind of a basic high disaster recovery instance. On the left side, we see this is a Linux Oracle, which has it's production Linux and Oracle. And on the right side is disaster recovery. And typically the DR is going to be at a geographically separate location. Copying this data to the other side, it's replicated by Oracle Data Guard. And everything that happens on the left side is immediately replicated to the other side. Now, of course, with a geographically separate situation, there's going to be latency. So there will be a slight delay, at least, for when data is entered on the left side and goes to the right side. But the point of it is to provide business continuity. Now, in the middle there, you see we have a backup location. Even though we have redundant data, we still may enter a situation where the DR instance or the primary or both are inaccessible. So you would have to build everything from scratch. And in that case, the backup is going to be kept at a third location. It can be a daily full backup or a weekly full backup with a nightly incremental. You could have hourly log backups, 2-hour log backups. It's up to you. It depends on what your RPO RTO is. If you have a 2-hour RPO RTO, then you'll have 2-hour log backups. If you have a 15-minute RPO RTO or RPO, you're going to have 15-minute log backups. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
All right, and this just describes what I just said. In addition to that, there is a retention period that you have to keep with. Generally, the retention period is you keep your full backups, your weekly full backups for a month. At the end of the month, you take the last full backup and keep that for a year, and the year backup you keep usually 7 years. Now in OCI, this is a little bit different. They do have some defaults where you can set those up. In OCI, if you're doing Oracle backup, it's all done automatically and you just tweak the script a little bit. For non-prod, it really depends on the business. You can make a full backup every night if it's data that doesn't change, or if your recovery plan for a non-prod instance is simply to refresh it for production, you can modify that as needed. And generally, best practice we found is keep 3 days worth of backups locally on disk so that you don't have to go through a lot of work to get something in case you need it quickly. Next slide. And one of the coolest things about Oracle database is flashback query. And this runs all the time. It's automatic. It's built into every version of Oracle, and it uses the undo table space. It allows you to query the contents of a table at almost any point in the past. Now, this depends solely on how much space you give to the undo table space. By default in Oracle, it's 15 minutes. However, I've bumped that up to as much as a week. And the reason you would want to do that is, let's say somebody messes something up on Friday, just a small amount of data, maybe delete some security records out of JDE Edwards. It goes unnoticed. The whole weekend goes by. Obviously, by the end of the day, that 15 minutes is gone. But you get in Monday, people start to notice things are wrong. It's not really till Tuesday that you figure out that you have lost some security records and people can't do anything. Now, if you did have the undo table space, 15 minutes, you're never going to get that back. You're going to have to restore from backup. But if you have your undo table space set large enough, you can get that back immediately and drop it right into the live table. Next slide. All right, this is disaster recovery. And on the left side, we see that the primary location was destroyed by an asteroid or something like that. And it's no longer able to do RMAN backups. But you still have your backup location that has all the backups you did up to that point. And your DR instance on the side did receive a final packet of data from it and applied it. Now, DR instance is still available. Now, JDE Edwards simply points to that DR instance, and from its perspective, it is still the same information as it was using before. Now, having a lossless DR failover is the perfect world, but there could be things in flight that couldn't make it due to physical or technical limitations. So you could lose if your latency was high enough that it took about a minute for a file to get from the left to the right, then you'd lose about a minute's worth of data. This is different for every client, and you would have to test it to determine what that is for yourself. Now, when you're pointing JDE Edwards to a DR instance and the JDE Edwards is still live on the primary side, there will be considerable latency as it goes across the additional hops to the network. But if you fail over JDE Edwards and the database to the DR site, then you shouldn't notice any latency except for what's introduced in the change in network connection from your location to there. Next slide. So DataGuard disaster recovery. So if you have the DBAS Extreme Performance Enterprise Edition, it comes with DataGuard, and you are able to use that any of those features between for any of your databases that you have in there. So these basically you have a standalone database on each side, and then DataGuard just keeps them in sync. You can also use BYOL to, if you already have Enterprise Edition, you can use that your BYOL credit to get the extreme performance, or you can create your own VMs in there and build it in a traditional sort of on-prem way. Next slide.
Bill, I know you're also certified in SQL Server. Just some high-level thoughts on what you would consider for best practices on cloud technology for HA. I know we just don't have a lot of time, but just a 1-minute synopsis.
Sure. Well, in SQL Server, its HADR is really fantastic. They use availability groups, and this is both in the cloud and on-prem. Availability groups is essentially it's like DataGuard, where you have a copy of data for that everybody's working on. That's your live production, and then it's replicated to a secondary location. Now, that secondary location can be anywhere, and you can have up to 10 of them. And what that does is, if your primary database fails, then it immediately points to the other fresh copy of data. And it's a combination of SQL and Windows clustering. But the cool thing about that is you can extend your availability group cluster into any other location. And you can also tie together multiple availability group clusters. So if you have different workloads in different locations, those can support each other. And it can get really complicated, but the great thing is that the SQL Server availability groups is the equivalent of, in some cases they have different flavors, different things, but I like it a lot, and it's really great for HADR.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
I think the rest is from me, so I'll continue.
Sure.
In the overall design, we'd really considered a once a year or as planned type of DR. It could be more often than that, but most of our clients test it once a year. We also, in doing the, something you've got to do a little more frequently is the testing of the backups. And what we've recommended and have done with our clients is an automated daily review of backup success, either depending upon the client. Some of it's actually an actual human being looks up the logs. In most cases, though, we've automated so an email gets set or we use a tool. You're going to want to do data recovery testing quarterly so that you don't go a full year or an actual disaster and realize your data recover, your data is no good or outdated or backed up improperly. So that's our recommendation. Also, in a lot of the cloud technologies, you do golden image backups. You take a picture of your let's say web server, and if you have to restore from it, we do recommend that you try testing that at least a couple times a year. You have to think about where your backup files are going to. Is if you're on-prem, your backup files might be going to tape, but if you're in the cloud, where's your tape at? Most of the backups are going to spinning disks, so you may have to transfer it to offline storage. A lot of the cloud technologies have what we call archive tiers or archive storage, and it's a lot lower cost than some of the higher availability storage locations. And again, you need to look at what your IT's retention policy is or your company's retention policy. And I mentioned this word once before, and that's immutable backups. If your backup files get purged because of ransomware or something like that, the best way to protect against ransomware is to have a backup that can't be tampered with under any circumstances, and that topic's called immutable backups. So rollback, you're going to have to wait for database transactions to flush out. Look at the DNS changes because you're going to have to roll them back as well. Just a few do's and don'ts. Keep as much of the active JDE architecture in the same fault domain. Consider using network security groups instead of subnets because the subnets end up hurting your performance. Don't subnet your database from your enterprise and web servers. Talked about it twice now. With JDE, you cannot have HA for the database across regions. Transactions will write to both DBs. Yeah, you'll have sync issues. The mesh technology is just not there. I've had lengthy discussions with the Denver development team about reference architectures and are they planning to make this work? And I don't know that we'll ever see this in JD Edwards as it is. I think it'd have to dramatically change its design for that to exist. Again, get rid of some of the designs from 2 to 3 years ago because performance wasn't acceptable if you followed one of those. General advice is if HA is important to you, use a fault domain because the fault domain performance is acceptable. At availability domains, it is not, in regions, just really impossible. And guess what, guys? We finished with 5 minutes to go. So, Mike, we will turn it back over to you to end the session. Go to chat.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we thank you, John and Bill, for jumping in.
Do you want to take control?
Yeah, something is.
Yeah, I'll stop
Hang
the
on.
share.
Yeah, there we go. Yes, so we Yeah, with just a few minutes left, I did not see any questions over the public chat. So I'm just going to share just to finish up, and we only have a few minutes anyway. Feel free, this presentation will be available in a day or two at our resource center on our website, getgsi.com. And where we can see other webcasts, even more John videos, and Bill. So that's a great thing. But you could also sign up for newsletters. Visit our YouTube channel, has a ton of how-to videos and also problem solution type of things. We have some educational resources on the website. And then we also have a problem-solving collaboration site called erp-talk.com, where we talk about a lot of different ERPs besides JD Edwards. We also are in NetSuite shop, and we also deal with ServiceNow, BMC, HubSpot, and obviously Oracle, other Oracle technologies. Of course, we have social media. We're especially strong in LinkedIn and YouTube. And I did not get any questions over. I will turn it over to you, John. Is there a common question that you see almost every client we begin working with that they commonly want you to tackle, or something like within the realm that sometimes is mystifying to a lot of the clients, no matter what their position is, or what size of database or system they have?
I tried to address most of those in the session, because, and I think I reiterated, like a lot of people wanting to use availability domains for HA, and it just doesn't work. The other biggie is people wanting to put the deployment server in a different network segment than the enterprise server and database server, and it's more about performance. A lot of people also ask questions about, oh, should I leave my DR site hot or shut it down? Well, you can save a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money if you can just bump that RTO from less than 15 minutes to an hour. And so that's the real, if you're an IT manager trying to deal with the business is like, oh, we all absolutely have to have 15-minute RTO, and you can just say, are you sure it's gonna double the cost of your system? Let's think about it. Let's say it costs $5,000 to run your main system, and it costs another, let's say $5,000 to have your DR site up. So that's $10,000 a month. But if all you do is leave up enough equipment to get files replicated and to make sure that your DR is on standby, it might be a $5,000 and a $1,000 for most of the year. Then for 2 weeks out of the year, you have to spin up that DR site for testing. Your cost is over 40% less by turning off and leaving your DR site in, I'd say, a lukewarm to cold state versus leaving it hot. So those are just a couple that I've run into.
Well, that's great. And again, thank you, John. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I know everyone's got a busy day, so the fact that we have a little bit of your time to share, we really appreciate it. Thank you. And you all, everyone who attended, will be made aware of the video when it is up. But thanks again, and have a great rest of the day, and hopefully a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.